There's a rule in every army on Earth. You carry what you are given. The weapon on your hip, the rounds in your magazine, the steel in your hand. None of it is a choice. It is an assignment. Stamped, cataloged, and handed down a chain of command that has never heard a bullet pass close enough to feel the air move. But somewhere between the quartermaster's table and the front line, something changes. Men who have seen what a weapon can and cannot do in the worst moments of their lives begin to make decisions that no regulation anticipated. They trade. They take from the dead. They bribe, barter, and carry weapons concealed beneath their coats, not because they are undisciplined, but because they understand something the officers writing manuals never had to learn in blood. This is the story of 10 pistols that soldiers chose for themselves, not because they were told to, because their lives depended on it. Number 10, the Browning High Power, the enemy's sidearm. That both sides trusted. Every soldier in the British Commonwealth was told what to carry. The Enfield No. 2 revolver was the standard. Simple, reliable enough, and easy to manufacture at a time when factories were running 24 hours a day just to keep pace with a war that consumed weapons faster than they could be made. The reasoning was sound. Standardization means logistics. One caliber, one spare parts system, one training. Doctrine. An army that fragments its own supply chain over personal preference is an army inviting disaster. But the men carrying the Enfield No. 2 knew something the procurement offices preferred not to acknowledge. The weapon had been modified, deliberately neutered, to remove its double-action capability, reducing the risk of accidental discharge among conscripted soldiers with minimal training. What remained was a revolver that required deliberate, slow cocking before each shot. In a close-quarters ambush, that difference between double and single action is not measured in seconds. It is measured in whether you survive. So British officers, paratroopers, and SOE operatives began acquiring something else. The Browning High Power, ironically designed by the same man who gave the world the M1911, produced in German-occupied Belgium for both the Wehrmacht and, through smuggled tooling, relocated to Canada for the Allies simultaneously. The same pistol carried by soldiers on opposite sides of the same wire. 13 rounds of 9mm in a single-stack magazine. A grip that sat naturally in the hand. A reputation that crossed enemy lines. What does it tell you about a weapon when both sides of a war choose to carry it? Not because they were ordered to, but because when the moment came, they reached for it. Number 9, the Luger. P08, the trophy that became a lifeline. American soldiers were not supposed to carry captured German pistols. The M1911A1 was issued, was proven, was sufficient. Regulations on the use of enemy weapons existed for good reason. In the chaos of combat, a soldier firing a distinctive foreign weapon could be mistaken for the enemy. The consequences of that mistake did not require much imagination. And yet, the Luger P08 became perhaps the most obsessively sought trophy of the entire European campaign. Soldiers traded cigarettes, rations, and favors for them. Officers kept them in desk drawers. Some men carried them loaded. The Luger was not objectively the best pistol of the war. Its mechanism was complex and sensitive. Fine Bavarian engineering that struggled with mud and moisture. Its toggle lock action was elegant in a factory and finicky in a foxhole. But it had power. Not ballistic power, psychological power. The Luger had been the face of German military, might since before the First World War. It appeared in propaganda posters, in newsreels, in the hands of every officer photograph that made it back to the Allied press. To take one was to take something from the myth itself. Some men carried them for that reason alone. Others, deep enough in contested territory that resupply had become unreliable, carried them because they had ammunition for them and nothing else. What the regulations never accounted for was the soldier so far forward that the Army supply lines had ceased to matter. Out there, you carried what fired. Number 8. The FN model, 1910. Small enough to disappear. Standard sidearms are designed to be visible. They communicate authority, rank, and the credible threat of force. A holstered pistol on the hip of an officer is not just a weapon, it is a statement. That visibility became a death sentence in occupied Europe. Resistance fighters, intelligence operatives, and partisans operating in cities full of German checkpoints needed something the uniform and holster logic of conventional warfare had never considered, a weapon that did not exist until the moment it was needed. The FN Model 1910, a Belgian pocket pistol chambered in .32 ACP or .380, had been designed before the First World War as a civilian concealed carry weapon. It was not meant for soldiers. It had no military pedigree, no ballistic ambition, no place in any army's procurement list. It fit inside a coat pocket. That was enough. SOE agents carried them into France. Dutch resistance members kept them beneath floorboards. Men and women who would be shot on sight if found armed chose this pistol because it gave them a chance, not a large one, but a chance, to fight back before the end. The .32 ACP round was not a powerful cartridge. Shot placement had to be precise, and the situation had to be close. Using it meant accepting that you were probably not going to survive the engagement regardless, but using it meant the people who came for you would not walk away untouched. There is a category of weapon that exists not to win a fight, but to make the cost of that fight real. The FN 1910 was that weapon, in the hands of people who had already accepted what they were risking. Number 7, the well rod, the pistol. That was never there. You will not find many soldiers who admitted to carrying the well rod. That was rather the point. The standard logic of military small arms is that a weapon should be capable of combat, suppressing fire, engaging multiple targets, functioning reliably under stress. The well rod violated every one of those principles by design. It was a bolt action, magazine-fed, integrally suppressed pistol developed by the Special Operations Executive. Single shot, manual action, wrapped in a cylinder no larger than a thick flashlight. It was not a combat weapon. It was an execution tool. The well rod was issued to agents who needed to neutralize a specific target, a collaborator, an informant, a sentry, without alerting anyone within earshot. Its sound signature when fired was described as comparable to a book dropped on a wooden floor. Not silent. Nothing is truly silent, but quiet enough. The weapon itself was designed to be left at the scene or destroyed. It was not meant to be recovered, analyzed, or traced. In some versions, the grip itself served as the magazine, so the entire lower portion could be discarded. Agents who carried it were operating in a world where the conventional rules of warfare had been entirely suspended. They had no uniform, no Geneva Convention protection, no chain of command that would acknowledge their existence if they were captured. They were deniable by design. Carrying a well rod was the physical acknowledgement of what you had agreed to become. What that cost a person, not tactically but in the long years after the war was over, was a question that very few of them answered publicly. Number 6, the Tokarev TT-33. Function without forgiveness. If you've made it this far, you already understand that the weapons soldiers preferred were rarely the ones that looked best on a parade ground. What you are about to hear about the next 5 entries moves us further into the territory where the distinction between preference and desperation begins to collapse. Soviet soldiers were issued the Tokarev TT-33 as standard sidearm, and unlike many of the weapons on this list, this one was not replaced out of dissatisfaction with the official issue. It was preferred because of what official issue meant in the Red Army of 1941. The Wehrmacht's invasion had shattered Soviet logistics in the opening months of the war. Entire armies were encircled. Supply lines were severed. Men fought with whatever they could recover from fallen comrades, from abandoned depots, from the bodies of the enemy. The Tokarev was chambered in 7.62 25 mm, a cartridge with extraordinary velocity for a pistol, round, capable of defeating some light body armor and penetrating further into cover than most contemporary handgun rounds. Soviet soldiers who had managed to hold on to theirs discovered that its penetrating capability was a significant advantage in the brutal urban fighting of Stalingrad. But the Tokarev had no external manual safety, none. Fire discipline was absolute or it was catastrophic. And in a conscript army suffering staggering losses, fire discipline was not always absolute. The weapon did not care. It fired when the trigger was pulled. It did not ask whether the soldier was ready, whether the target was correct, whether the situation had been fully assessed. There was a brutal honesty to that design. In war, honesty is often the only currency that retains its value. Number 5. The Nambu type. 14. Trust-betrayed Japanese officers carried the Nambu Type 14 because they were required to. That distinction between carrying by requirement and carrying by choice is at the core of what makes this entry different from every other on this list. Every other weapon here was chosen. The Nambu was endured. The Type 14 had a reputation among the officers condemned to carry it that bordered on betrayal. Its firing pin was fragile. In cold weather, conditions that were entirely foreseeable given Japan's campaigns in Manchuria and the Pacific's winter operations at altitude, the pin would break, rendering the weapon entirely non-functional at exactly the moment it would be needed most. The magazine had a tendency to fall free if not properly secured. The safety mechanism was awkward and counterintuitive. The grip safety required a specific and deliberate hand position to disengage, meaning a panicked or injured soldier might find the weapon refusing to fire. Japanese officers of means began acquiring alternatives. American M19 lens taken from dead Marines became extraordinarily valued. German Lugers reached the Pacific through diplomatic and trade channels before the war and were carefully maintained. Some officers carried Nimbus they had modified personally, and others carried weapons they simply never reported to their superiors. What makes this story particular is the cultural dimension. In the Imperial Japanese military, the sidearm was not just a tool. It was an extension of an officer's honor. Replacing it, discarding it, acknowledging that it was inadequate, carried connotations that went beyond the tactical. There were officers who died with a Nambu that they did not trust. Whether that was loyalty or tragedy depends entirely on how you see the relationship between duty and survival. Number 4. The Mauser C96, the weapon that refused to die. By the standards of 1939, the Mauser C96 was an antique. First produced in 1896, it had fought in the Boer War, the First World War, the Chinese Civil War, and the Spanish Civil War before the Second World War had even begun. Any rational assessment of the situation suggested it had been superseded by decades of more refined design. Rational assessments did not survive contact with the reality of the Chinese theater, the Eastern, front's partisan warfare, or the various irregular conflicts that existed on the war's margins. The C96's 10-round fixed magazine, chambered in 7.63 TN25 mm, offered firepower that exceeded most contemporary pistols. Its detachable wooden shoulder stock converted it into a short carbine with meaningful accuracy at ranges where a conventional pistol became unreliable. In environments where rifles were unavailable and submachine gun ammunition was scarce, that flexibility was not a historical curiosity. It was a practical solution. Chinese nationalist and communist fighters both carried it. German officers who had inherited family heirlooms brought them to the front. Partisan leaders in occupied Europe valued its semi-carbine capability. The Mauser C96 persisted because war is not interested in what is modern. War is interested in what works, and in enough hands, across enough decades of conflict, a weapon accumulates a body of knowledge about how to use it effectively that newer designs simply haven't earned yet. Some soldiers trusted the C96 not despite its age, but because of it. It had been to war before. It had come back. Number 3. The Colt 1903 Pocket Hammerless. The officer's secret American generals were supposed to carry the M1911A1. It was a point of symbolic importance. The commanding officer armed with the same weapon as his men, united in materiel, if not in rank. The reality in the officer corps of the European and Pacific theaters told a different story. The Colt Model 1903 Pocket Hammerless, chambered in .32 ACP, small enough to sit flat against the body beneath a dress uniform, became the quietly preferred sidearm of a remarkable number of senior American officers. Eisenhower carried one. So did George Patton, alongside his more famous ivory-handled revolvers. Omar Bradley owned one. The list continues well past what coincidence could explain. The official reasoning, when officers bothered to offer it, centered on the 1903's concealability and its suitability for situations where a full-size pistol was impractical. True enough. But there was another dimension. Senior commanders operate in environments where they may be targeted specifically. An officer in a staff car approaching a checkpoint does not want the enemy to immediately identify his rank by the weapon on his hip. The 1903's civilian profile disrupted that identification. The M1911 said soldier, the 1903 said nothing at all. In a war where the gap between a general's headquarters and the front line was sometimes measured in hundreds of yards, that ambiguity was not vanity. It was a security calculation made by men who understood that their capture or death would cost more than their own lives. What would you choose? The symbol of command, or the weapon that might let you survive long enough to exercise it? Number 2. The Webley MiG-6 Service Revolver. When the old became the only. There is a particular cruelty in discovering that the weapon you were promised does not exist in sufficient quantities to arm the men who need it. In the desperate months of 1940 and 1941, British production and American supply had not yet scaled to meet the catastrophic losses of equipment at Dunkirk and throughout the North African campaign. Warehouses were inventoried, armories were searched, private collections were requisitioned. What emerged, in the hands of Home Guard units, second-line troops and officers whose modern sidearms had been lost or destroyed, was the Webley MiG-6, a top-break .455 caliber revolver that had been the British service revolver of the First World War. A weapon designed in an era of cavalry charges and trench raids, now being carried by men facing tanks and aircraft and weapon systems it had never been designed to oppose. The Webley was reliable. That much was not in dispute. Its top-break action allowed it to be reloaded quickly even by cold or injured hands, a design virtue that remained valid across the decades. But it chambered .455 Webley, ammunition that was increasingly difficult to source, that required specific supply chains, that could not be supplemented from captured enemy stocks or borrowed from Allied units. A weapon without ammunition is not a weapon. It is weight. Men who carried Webleys in the Second World War understood they were holding something. The war had already moved past. But in a moment with nothing else, in a guard post in the western desert, in a training depot waiting for shipments that were overdue, it was what they had. And what you have when everything else is gone becomes precious in a way that has nothing to do with its specifications. Number 1. The Walther PPK. The weight of what it meant. There are weapons that end wars. There are weapons that define eras. And then there is the Walther PPK, a small, elegant German police pistol that became, arguably, the single most morally weighted sidearm of the entire conflict. It was a weapon of the powerful, the feared, and ultimately, the cornered. The PPK, Polizei Pistola Criminal Modell, had been designed for plainclothes police work. Compact, in .32 ACP, double-action capable, with a fixed barrel that made it more accurate than most pistols of its size. Gestapo agents carried it. SS officers kept it on their persons. It appeared in the holsters and coat pockets of the machinery of Nazi occupation across an entire continent. Resistance fighters who managed to acquire one understood that they now held the instrument of their oppressors. Some discarded them out of revulsion. Others kept them precisely because the .32 PPK was not a battlefield weapon. It was a weapon for close work, for urban environments, for the kind of violence that did not announce itself. And then there is the other history of this pistol, the one that gives it the heaviest weight of all. On the 30th of April, 1945, in a concrete bunker beneath a burning city, Adolf Hitler used a Walther PPK to end his own life. The war in Europe ended 11 days later, the same weapon used by the men who enforced the Holocaust, who executed partisans, who stood at checkpoints in occupied cities with the power of life and death over the people before them. That weapon became the instrument that closed the chapter. No other sidearm of the Second World War carries that contradiction. The weapon of absolute power turned inward at the moment of absolute collapse.